Our last witness is Edward Davies, who's Policy Director of the Centre for Social Justice, an independent think tank started by prominent Conservatives. We've been looking at families as somehow the drivers of inequality, and maybe you wouldn't necessarily disagree, but might think that we're looking perhaps through the wrong end of the telescope. It's precisely because good outcomes come from strong families that we ought to be building them up.
Exactly that. I think the conversation about inheritance probably misses the point. The reason people don't like inheritance is nothing to do with cash, which is the framing that it's a tax. It's because it's a fundamental attack on the family. And the family is the bedrock of civilization, of every civilized nation that has ever existed. And as we undermine that, we end up in a position where I think we are now, where the government actually cannot afford to support the breakdown that we have in family life, where it's leading to political problems as well, as we see the disintegration of democracy around the world. And it might actually, if it's not too hyperbolic to say, end civilization within the next couple of 100 years.
A bit apocalyptic, but okay. Yeah. Mona Siddiqui.
Sure, this is a much tamer question rather than ending civilization. Can I ask you how you define a family?
So people define families in all sorts of different ways.
But you, how would you?
The thing I'd want to really push is that people say all families are the same. The reality is their outcomes are not. And that's a really hard thing to say. But children who are raised in married families to their biological parents statistically do best. And it is that we are really squeamish about talking about that is leading to major problems in Western society.
And so for you, the family is primarily a heterosexual unit?
So the reality of where we are right now in politics is that it has been legal for, how many years? 12 years now to have gay marriage. And so I think we need to incorporate that in our conversation about family and understand that is where we are. But the thing I would say is really important here is that has been the focus of the conversation around marriage and family life now for about 20 years. And it's such a small part of the equation that we have to move on from it.
So I think I agree that, that things that make us truly happy are what happen at home in our relationships, our families. But a lot of people don't have a home. And even for those who do, home isn't always a refuge.
Yeah.
So what does that say about the way our families, we should think about family life and relationships and good emotional support?
Yeah. Some families don't work well and they should disintegrate. They should take apart. We should have divorce. That is a good thing. The difficulty is we are now in a situation in this country where 50 years ago, 90% of children were raised by their mum and dad. Now it's about 50-50. And we as a society simply cannot cope with that level of family breakdown. So when you hear in the news there is a crisis in child and adolescent mental health services, what you are hearing is the breakdown of family is driving a situation where the NHS cannot cope. When you hear that economic inactivity is being driven by young people with mental health conditions, what you are hearing is our economy cannot cope with the level of family breakdown.
So if marriage is the bedrock of a stable society, and I'm sure a lot of people would agree with you, why do you think the Archbishop's Commission on the Family refused to single out marriage as the bedrock of a good society? It pointed to honouring singleness, empowering children, supporting relationships, but it didn't mention family and marriage.
Yeah, I'm afraid I think that was a massive, massive error. I think the church needs to take a long, hard look at itself because they are the institution that marries people. And if they won't stand up for it anymore, we are in real trouble.
So why do you think people are marrying less and having fewer children?
I think we simply don't value it anymore. I think there are some big structural economic questions around the marriageability of men. I think there are some questions around whether we do so. I mean, really basic things like the tax system and the welfare system do not recognise couples anymore, whereas they do in almost the entire Western world beyond the UK.
But you're making it sound almost as if the main reason is because it's a good financial transaction as well.
So I think there are many, many cultural reasons. So you mentioned the church. The church no longer seems to promote marriage. Our tax system doesn't promote marriage. Our schools, our education doesn't promote marriage.
But why do you think that is? I mean, isn't it surely a reflection of something has shifted in what we value? And maybe marriage and the ideal that marriage always gives stability is just no longer there.
So I think it is absolutely there that marriage brings stability. I think the statistics are really clear on that. So just to give you an example, the poorest 20% of people who are married are more likely to stay together than the richest 20% who are cohabiting. So there is absolutely a difference.
Well, so can I press you on what you mean by stability then? I mean, stability is a very opaque word. You can have couples who stay married for the sake of their children in awful loveless marriages. Would you rather have that than a family?
It's interesting. That doesn't happen very often. So actually, in terrible loveless marriages, people do tend to separate. The issue is that a lot of marriages are not loveless, but they separate anyway. And actually, the even bigger issue than that is not that families are breaking apart, it's that they're not forming in the first place. So actually, the majority of children are not born to committed parents now. So we are not
By
forming
committed,
families.
you mean married? Do you?
By married or civil partnership.
So what does that say about society's values then? That people are choosing not to marry or even be in committed relationships?
So there is a sort of a meta macro question, I think, about the rise of individualism. So certainly it's not just marriage we're not committing to. We're not committing to religious affiliation. You mentioned the church there. We're not committing to labour unions. We're not committing to sports clubs and all those things that are sort of come downstream of individualism. But marriage in particular is having a damaging effect.
Maybe that's not necessarily just about individualism. People don't trust institutions. People don't trust what traditionally we thought, if we belong to that community or that partnership, it would give me meaning and happiness and all the rest of it. And actually people find that these institutions don't.
Interestingly, statistically, though, they do. So, I mean, a classic example of marriage is that men are healthier, happier, they live longer, they earn more money.
Women, though.
So actually, women do slightly better, but not as well as men. So it's in everyone's interest. They are fairly egalitarian, but men particularly benefit. And actually, it's men at the moment who are part of the sort of the questions we're asking around sort of Andrew Tates of this world and things. What's going on with men? And I think encouraging men into this would be a really good thing.
Ash Sarkar.
Don't get me started on what's going on with men. I guess my first question for you, if I could just pull you away from policy a little bit, is what does it mean to be a good parent?
It's a great question, and I think if we knew that, we'd all be doing it. And I think, I am one, and I know I fail every day. I think there's a couple of things. First thing is just turning up. I think as a parent, actually, it's being present. And some of that is about being in a committed relationship with your child's other parent. There is something really important about that relationship and how it models what the world should look like. So essentially, home is where you learn to love as a child. And if you see those relationships as committed and sacrificial and important, then you will grow up thinking that is how you love. But if you see them as transactional and collapsible and you can move on at a whim, then that is how you will grow up. And that will impact wider society.
I really agree with you about home being the place where you learn to love. And I'm at the age where a lot of my friends are having babies or starting to try to have babies. And something which every single one of them says, including people whose parents stayed together for a really long time, is, I don't want to do this whatever thing that my parents did to me. Every single one of them says that. What do you think that's about, that so many people, when they're becoming parents, really emphasise that they want to break a cycle of some kind?
Yeah. I won't repeat it in full, but the classic Philip Larkin poem,
yeah.
Your mum and dad, they do things.
We all know that.
I think we're in that situation where that is true for all of us. That none of us are in perfect families. All of us will have experienced some sort of harm within our families. And it may have been really explicitly awful abuse that you had to get out of that place, or it may just be you argue a bit. But within that, I think we have to accept that doesn't change the fact that committed families, committed relationships, doing the best they can is really important. And that as a society, we have slightly moved back from that we don't value that commitment. So although we will bring all sorts of baggage from our parents and our families and what have you, we have to be clear as a society that doesn't undermine the importance of commitment.
What do you make of the idea of intergenerational trauma? Like, I know it's a bit voguish at the moment, but what do you think about that idea?
Yeah, I think it definitely holds some truth. And I think often actually, so we work at the CSJ with all sorts of small charities working with people who are in poverty, whether that be through unemployment, through drug addiction, coming out of prison, whatever it may be. And you absolutely see that the environment they have grown up in really affects how they are 30, 40, 50 years down the line. Again, though, I bring it back to say that trauma is often father leaving the house in their childhood, and that is the case for almost half the children in the country now.
I mean, I guess my big question for you is this, is that I'm with you in terms of the family, however that looks, being a stabilising force in children's lives and a stabilising force for society. But that a key part of progress is the fact that we want to escape our family in some ways, and that we want to do things differently from how we were parented. And that society needs both. It needs this sort of the stability and the home and the kind of being built on a rock, and it needs that desire to escape and to remake and to break a cycle.
I mean, there's a wonderful argument for progress, and there's no doubt that the marriage that the ancient Romans had is completely different from the marriage that we might have today, and that the sort of the patriarchal image of family and marriage that we might have had in the 17 and 1800s probably needed to change. But what hasn't changed is that moment of commitment, that decision, rather than sliding into a relationship, maybe picking up a mortgage and then suddenly having a child and thinking, I haven't really thought about committing to this relationship. That moment of commitment becomes really important, so that actually when things go wrong, and they will go wrong, think you will get ill, you will lose your job, things like that will happen, that you had this moment in the past where you said, through thick and thin, we're going to try and make this work. And it's not a silver bullet, it won't always work, but it does make it far more likely that you will make it through.
I mean, very quickly, have you ever heard of a phrase called lesbian velocity?
No, I'm afraid I haven't.
All right, or U-hauling. Have you ever heard of that?
I've heard of U-Haul, the van hire.
All right, so basically it's this idea that lesbian couples in particular, they sort of like speed run to commitment. And so they'll move in together a lot quicker and they'll, want to have kids a lot quicker. And just anecdotally in my life, like, that is true. But it doesn't necessarily always come with marriage or a civil partnership. There is something about two women getting together where they really, really want the commitment. And I suppose the thing I'm saying is that, are there sort of social norms which can emerge and don't need marriage, don't need that ceremony, because there's a sort of strong pattern or trend?
So if that is the case, I think what we would have seen is that cohabiting couples are increasingly doing well and their children are doing well, and that's simply not the case, that the children of people who've had an explicit moment where they've said, this is our equitable, stated level of commitment and we're in this together, they and their children just do better. And there will be absolutely cohabiting couples who do well, and there will be married couples who do terribly, but at a population level, that moment of commitment seems very important.
Edward Davies, thank you very much indeed.